The priest grabbed my wrist at my mother's funeral hard enough to stop me in the aisle. Not gently, not like a grieving old man asking for a moment. He grabbed me like he was trying to keep me from walking off a cliff. "Do not go home with Victor," he said. Rain hammered the church windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Behind me, people were still filing out of the pews in their black coats, murmuring about casseroles and sympathy and where the reception was being held. In front of me, Father Adrian's face had gone the color of candle wax. Then he pushed a brass key into my palm. "Bus station. Locker 42. Go now." "Alone." I stared at him. "What?" His eyes flicked over my shoulder toward the sanctuary doors, toward the man everyone in town thought was my father. Victor Hale, senior partner at Hale and Weatherby. Deacon, donor, smiling widower. The kind of man who had his hand on everybody's back and a favor tucked inside every handshake. Father Adrian lowered his voice to a whisper that scraped. "Your mother made me swear I would wait until she was buried. She said if she died first, Victor would move fast. She said you would be safest if you knew before he did." "Knew what?" The priest swallowed once. I watched his throat jump. "That you are not who you think you are." My fingers closed around the key so tightly the teeth bit my skin. At the far end of the aisle, Victor looked up from speaking to two judges and found me standing there with the priest. Even from that distance, I saw it happen. That tiny shift in his expression. Not fear exactly, more like calculation. A man adjusting a mask. Father Adrian stepped back before I could say another word. He lifted his chin just enough to tell me the conversation was over. "Do not go home," he said again. "And whatever you find, don't call anyone from your own phone until you understand what your mother left you." Then he turned and walked toward the sacristy as if he had not just split my life down the middle. I stood there with the rain pounding the stained glass, my mother in the ground, and a locker key digging into my hand like a second pulse. And for the first time in 34 years, the man waiting for me at the church doors felt less like family and more like an open mouth. Victor opened his arms when I stepped outside under the awning, performing grief for the people lingering near the flower vans. "There you are," he said. "I've been looking everywhere. You disappeared." His voice was warm, controlled, just loud enough for nearby ears. I'd heard that voice in court hallways, at donor dinners, in hospital waiting rooms, at every Thanksgiving where he carved the turkey like he was dividing a kingdom. It was a useful voice. It made women trust him and men want his approval. He put a hand on my shoulder. I moved away. He paused, and for half a second something flat and cold flashed under the concern. "Long day," he said softly. "Come home. There are people waiting. Your Aunt Renee brought food. I know this is hard." Home. That word hit differently now. Home was the red brick colonial on Ashbury Lane where he lived, where my mother had spent the last 18 years, where the alarm code was Victor's birthday, where the downstairs study stayed locked unless he was inside it, where my bedroom had been converted into a home gym 6 months after I moved out, like evidence cleared from a room. I looked at the rain coming down over the cemetery parking lot and thought about Father Adrian's hand shaking when he gave me the key. "I need air," I said. Victor studied my face. He was too skilled to press in public. That was one of his talents. He knew when to be patient because control lasted longer when the other person mistook it for kindness. "Take an hour," he said. "Then come by. There are legal things to discuss." Legal things. Not memories. Not condolences. Not how I was holding up after watching my mother get lowered into wet earth. Legal things. He squeezed my shoulder once, like he was blessing me, then walked toward the black sedan waiting for him at the curb. People made room for him automatically. They always did. I waited until his car pulled away. Then I crossed the parking lot in the rain, got into my truck, and drove the opposite direction. The Greyhound station sat on the south edge of town between a shuttered pawn shop and a laundromat with half its letters burned out. The place smelled like wet denim, old coffee, and fluorescent lights that had been buzzing since the late 90s. Nobody looked at me twice. A woman bounced a baby on one hip near the vending machines. 2 teenage boys slept with their backpacks as pillows. A man in a camouflage jacket argued with the ticket clerk about change. Locker 42 was along the back wall beneath a cracked map of interstate routes. My hand shook when I slid the key into the lock. Inside was a canvas bank bag, a manila envelope with my name on it in my mother's handwriting, and a small digital recorder wrapped in a dish towel. I knew her handwriting better than my own. She labeled leftovers in the fridge with it. signed birthday cards with it. Wrote grocery lists that were always too neat for grocery lists. Every apple and onion and paper towel roll lined up like she was trying to impose order on a world that ignored her. I opened the envelope first. Daniel, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Adrian kept his promise. Do not take this bag to Victor's house. Do not tell him you have it. Do not assume he knows how much I kept from him. Your real name is not Daniel Hale. Your father was not Victor. Read everything before you act. Please. Rashness is what he counts on in other people. And Danny, I am sorry. More than you know. Mom, the station noises dimmed around me until all I could hear was that last line. I am sorry. She only called me Danny when it was just the two of us. Victor called me Daniel, clipped and formal, the way lawyers talk to sons they consider mildly disappointing. The world called me Dan. My mother had been the only person left who still used the name from my childhood. I set the note on the bench beside me and opened the bank bag. There was a certified birth certificate, another smaller envelope, a packet of property records, free photographs, a notarized affidavit, and folded between two legal pads, a thin gold chain with a tiny St. Christopher medal I'd never seen before. I looked at the birth certificate first because my brain went there the way a tongue goes to a broken tooth. Name, Daniel Rowan Mercer. Mother, Evelyn Mercer. Father, Samuel Rowan. Not Victor Hale. Not even my mother's name as I'd known it. Evelyn Mercer. My mother's first name had been Evelyn before she married. She told me that, in passing, once, the way people mention old apartments or former hairstyles. But Samuel Rowan. I read it again, and again. The station blurred. Not dramatically, not in a movie way. More like my eyes stopped agreeing with the world for a few seconds. I sat on that hard plastic bench with wet cuffs and funeral dirt on my shoes and tried to line up 34 years of memory with one state-sealed sheet of paper. The second envelope contained a court order for a legal name change issued when I was 2 years old. Daniel Rowan Mercer had become Daniel Hale by petition of Victor Hale following adoption. At the bottom, in that same neat handwriting, my mother had written, he wanted Rowan erased first. Not Mercer, Rowan. I opened the photographs. The first one showed my mother younger than I had ever seen her in real life, laughing with her head thrown back on a dock somewhere, sun in her hair, one hand gripping the sleeve of a man beside her. He was tall, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, wearing a faded blue t-shirt and holding a squirming baby against his chest. Me. There was no mistaking it. Even through baby cheeks and a ridiculous yellow hat, it was me. And the man holding me had my face. Not exactly. Not in a mirror way, but enough to make my stomach drop. The nose, the brow, the deep-set eyes, the way one side of his mouth pulled higher when he smiled. The second photograph was just that man, standing at the bow of a small white boat on a lake under a bright spring sky. On the back, in my mother's hand, Samak Greywater, 6 days before. The third photograph was grainy and shot from far away. 2 boats on water, one white, one dark green. You could barely make out the people in them, just shapes. But on the back, written with less care, like her hand had been shaking, this was not an accident. I realized I was holding my breath. The affidavit was from a woman named Lena Voss, dated 19 years earlier. She stated she had worked part-time as a cleaner in my parents' first house and on one occasion overheard Victor Hale and my mother arguing in the kitchen after midnight. According to Lena, Victor said, "The boy is mine now in every way that matters, and you will stop saying that name in this house." No court seal on that one, just a notary stamp and a signature. The recorder was the last thing I touched. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. There was static first, then my mother's breathing. Thin, labored. "Danny," she said, and hearing her voice when I'd buried her 2 hours earlier nearly undid me on the spot. "If Adrian gave you this, then I ran out of time." She coughed. I could hear water being moved, glass against wood. "You need to listen to all of it, even if you get angry with me. Especially then." A long pause. "Your father's name was Samuel Rowan. He built houses on the North Shore before the development money came in. He was not rich, not at first. He was patient. He saw value before other men did, and that made people underestimate him." Another breath. Victor was his attorney, then his friend, then the man who stood beside me in a black tie at the funeral and told me he would help me survive. My hand tightened on the recorder. "He helped himself," she whispered, "and I let him. That is the part you will hate me for, and maybe you should." She spoke in pieces, with long stretches of air between them, but the story came anyway. Samuel Rowan and Victor Hale had gone into a partnership over land near Greywater Lake, just before a major highway expansion was announced. My father, Samuel, had refused to sell early to a larger developer because he believed the value would triple in 2 years. Victor had pushed, then pushed harder. There had been arguments, missing documents, a line of credit Samuel claimed he never authorized. Then the day on the lake. Everyone said Samuel fell overboard during a storm. There had been no storm. "I did not see it happen," my mother said. "That is the truth. I heard enough, saw enough afterward, and understood enough to know I had married into a trap." Then came the part that made my skin go cold. Victor told me I was emotional, grieving, confused. He said if I made wild accusations, they would take you from me. He had a way of making the room smaller when he spoke, of making your own thoughts sound childish in your head. He knew the judge. He knew the detective. He knew which bills I could not pay. By the time I understood what I had allowed, he had already become necessary. Necessary. That word landed harder than murder for a second because I knew exactly what she meant. Some forms of control don't begin with shouting. They begin with rescue, with signatures, with mortgage payments and school tuition and "I'm only trying to help." They begin with a man stepping into a hole and making sure you notice that he's the only bridge out. Victor insisted on the adoption, she went on. He said it would protect you. He said Rowan was dangerous now, that there were business enemies, that your father had left debts and bitterness behind him. I was weak, Danny, weak and frightened and ashamed. I told myself I was keeping you safe. Some days I even believed it. I closed my eyes. I was sitting in a bus station listening to a dead woman apologize to me from inside a dish towel. Then her voice changed. Smaller. Urgent. "There is one more thing. Sam did not die broke." Victor made sure that was the story, but it was never the truth. There were trusts, land options, mineral rights beneath the north parcels. I found papers after Victor moved the office out of our old garage. He never knew I copied them. If the court ever follows the chain far enough, it won't just prove fraud. It will prove motive. I heard her move again, like she was reaching for something. "There is a woman named Ruth Calder. She was Sam's sister, your aunt. Victor told me years ago she moved away and wanted no part of us. That was another lie. I wrote to her once after your 17th birthday. The letter came back opened, not by the postal service. By him. I stopped trying after that because I was a coward." A shaky breath. "Father Adrian has her last address. He promised not to give it to me unless I was ready to do the right thing. I never was. Maybe you will be." The recording ended with a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "He will think you are easy to corner. Let him." Then static. I sat in that station until the overhead speakers announced a bus to Columbus boarding at Gate 3. Somewhere behind me, somebody laughed too loudly. A soda machine hummed. The normal world kept going. Mine had stopped. "Your real name is not Daniel Hale. Your father was not Victor. There are trusts, land, a sister, an open letter." My mother had known for years. Not every detail, maybe, but enough. She had lived in a house with the man she believed killed my father and changed my name and controlled what was left. And she had stayed. I wanted to hate her. Part of me did. I'm not going to lie and make myself noble. On that plastic bench, with my suit collar damp and my head splitting open, I hated her for waiting until death made honesty convenient. I hated Victor for existing. I hated myself for not seeing anything. But under all of that, something else was happening. Not panic. Inventory. That was how my mind worked when the floor gave way. Not because I was fearless. Because fear was messy, and somebody had to start stacking facts. So I spread the documents across the bench and read every page twice. There were copies of land deeds for 97 acres along the north side of Greywater, then and now chopped into parcels beneath 3 shell companies. There were bank transfers routed through a defunct title agency that had once shared office space with Victor's first firm. There was a photocopy of a handwritten note signed SR that looked like instructions for moving assets into custodial trusts for my son Daniel Rowan Mercer. There was a tax map with 2 lots circled in red and the words "hold these." Then there was one final page tucked into the back of the bank bag. If Victor realizes you know before you are ready, he will either try to buy you, discredit me, or make you think this is too old to matter. It matters. Do not meet him alone after he understands what you have. For a full minute, I just stared at that sentence. Then my phone buzzed. Victor. I let it ring. It buzzed again. Then a text. Where are you? Another. People are asking for you. Then, 15 seconds later. There are things in the house we need to secure. Come now. Secure. Not discuss. Not remember your mother. Secure. That one word told me more than anything he'd said all day. I packed everything back into the bank bag, wrapped the recorder again, and walked out into the rain. I did not go home. I drove to the only person in town who had seen me at my smartest, my angriest, and my worst, and had never once mistaken silence for weakness. Maya Torres lived above her bakery on Franklin Street in a loft apartment that always smelled like cinnamon, coffee beans, and whatever battle she was currently winning against sleep. We had known each other since high school. She had been class president and debate captain, and the first person to tell Victor to his face that his handshake felt like a real estate contract. I had been the quiet scholarship kid he tolerated with careful disappointment because I chose archives over law school. Maya opened the door in flour-smudged leggings and a long gray sweater, took one look at my face, and said, "Who died besides your mother?" I held up the bank bag. Apparently my whole life. She didn't say anything cute after that, just stepped aside and let me in. 40 minutes later, we had everything spread across her kitchen table under pendant lights, coffee going cold beside the deed records, rain streaking the tall loft windows. I played the recording once. Only once. Maya sat with both hands around her mug, eyes fixed on nothing. When it ended, she asked the question I had been avoiding. Do you think he killed Samuel Rowan? I looked down at the lake photograph again. Yes. Do you think your mother believed it? Yes. Maya exhaled through her nose. Then Victor is going to move tonight. Probably. And he thinks you're emotional. I almost laughed. He thinks I'm soft. That word hung there. Soft. Victor's favorite insult when he wanted to sound affectionate. He'd say it at dinner when I refused to laugh at one of his stories about judges or clients or men who'd ruined themselves through sentiment. He said it when I quit pre-law after sophomore year and transferred into records management and historical preservation. You've always had a soft spot for dead paper, Danny. He said it when I chose a modest job at the county records office over the clerkship he arranged with a friend. To Victor, the world was made of predators and assets. If you weren't one, you were the other. And because I didn't posture, didn't shout, didn't swagger through rooms asking to be feared, he filed me under harmless. That turned out to be the first truly useful thing he ever gave me. I worked in the county archives building 3 blocks from the courthouse, in a climate-controlled basement full of probate records, land transfers, corporate filings, old maps, estate packets, divorce decrees, and every paper trail this city had tried to forget since 1891. Most people heard records office and pictured dust. They never imagined how much power sits inside old paper. They also never imagined that a man could spend 12 years learning exactly where signatures break, where shell companies overlap, where judges' nephews get appointed, where title chains kink just enough to expose fraud if you tug the right year. I wasn't a lawyer. I was worse for a man like Victor. I was patient. Maya leaned forward and tapped the property map. If this is real, the North Shore parcels alone are worth a fortune now. I know. And if he buried those assets through fake transfers and custodial structures. It's not just inheritance, I said. It's fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, tax exposure. Depending on what he touched when he changed my name, maybe guardianship abuse. She studied me. There are moments when people who love you realize you are not as breakable as they've been afraid you might be. It's not that they discover a stranger. They discover a room in the house they somehow never entered. What are you thinking? She asked. I looked at Victor's text again. I think he expects me to come in shaking and accuse him. I think he expects to calm me down, confuse me, maybe cry if he has to. I think he expects me to bring whatever I found. And I'm not going to disappoint him. Maya frowned. Dan, no, I said. Listen, he's cautious when he feels watched. He's careless when he thinks he's winning. If I go dark, he lawyers up and starts scrubbing. If I show up hurt and half-informed, he talks. She watched me for another second, then nodded once. That is such a terrible idea, she said. So obviously I'm coming with you and waiting outside. I shook my head. No, Daniel. Maya, she crossed her arms. I hate when you use my full name like you're filing me. Despite everything, the edge of my mouth twitched. She saw it and softened. Fine, she said. Then you leave your location on. And if I don't hear from you in 30 minutes, I call somebody louder than both of us. I promised. Then I slid the recorder, the birth certificate, and the land copies back into the bank bag and left the affidavit and photographs with her. Insurance. You learn that in archives too. Never keep the original in one place if the building might burn. Victor's house glowed at the end of Ashbury Lane like a magazine spread when I pulled up that night. Warm amber windows. Landscaping lights. The sort of wealth that tries not to look like wealth, but fails because restraint itself is expensive. His Mercedes was in the drive. So was my Aunt Renee's Lexus, but her car left as I reached the front walk. She rolled down the passenger window long enough to say, "He's in one of his moods, sweetheart," in the tone women use when they've spent years normalizing a man's weather, then drove off. Victor opened the front door before I knocked. He was in shirt sleeves now, tie gone, reading glasses on, bourbon in hand. If you'd painted an American portrait of respectable mourning, you'd have used him for reference. "There you are," he said. I was getting worried. He stepped aside to let me in. I stayed on the threshold. The foyer smelled like lemon polish and lilies from the funeral arrangements somebody had already moved into crystal vases. My mother's umbrella still leaned in the stand by the coat closet. A silk scarf she wore every spring lay draped over the table under the mirror. Those small things hit harder than the grave had. Victor followed my eyes and lowered his voice. I know. That was another of his skills, making his sympathy sound like superior knowledge. I lifted the bank bag enough for him to notice it. The priest gave me something. His face did not change. Only the hand holding the bourbon glass tightened slightly. What kind of something? Documents. Silence. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come inside. Let's not do this in front of the neighbors." There it was. Not if. Let's. I went in. He led me to the study at the rear of the house, the room I was never allowed in as a kid unless summoned. Walnut shelves, leather chairs, diplomas, framed campaign photos with mayors and judges. On the desk, neat stacks of sympathy cards already tied with ribbon because Victor organized grief the way other men organize taxes. He closed the door behind us. "Sit," he said. I remained standing. Something about that seemed to annoy him more than any accusation could have. Not because it mattered, because it was a refusal so small he couldn't scold it without revealing himself. "What did Adrian give you?" he asked. I looked around the room slowly. Funny. Mom said she hated this office. Said it always smelled like a sealed room. Victor's expression cooled by a degree. "Your mother said many things near the end." I found a birth certificate. He set the bourbon down. Still not dramatic. Not guilty. Just still. And it says my father was Samuel Rowan. The name crossed the room like a blade.
Victor did not blink. I wondered when that would surface. That, more than anything, almost made me lose control. Not denial, not outrage, not confusion, annoyed acknowledgement. I heard my own pulse in my ears. "You wondered." "Yes." He folded his hands in front of him. Evelyn had a sentimental relationship to the past. Illness made that worse. I suspected she kept old papers. "Old papers," I repeated. "Daniel, sit down." "No." The word cracked harder than I intended. Victor's eyes sharpened. "Fine," he said. "Then listen carefully. Samuel Rowan was your biological father. That is true. He was also reckless, unstable, and headed toward financial ruin when he died. Your mother was drowning. I stepped in. I gave you my name, my home, my support. Whatever melodrama Adrian has fed you, it does not change what I did for you. Support. Like I was a scholarship case he'd sponsored through childhood. I reached into the bag and laid the photograph of Samuel holding me on the desk between us. Victor looked at it once. No more than that. Then I placed the lake photo beside it, then the deed copies, then the court order changing my name. His jaw ticked. "I also have a recording from my mother," I said, "and she says Samuel's death was no accident." The room changed. It's hard to describe if you've never watched a man's charm switch off in real time. Not disappear, switch off. Like a lit sign going dark behind glass. Victor leaned back slightly and looked at me as if I had become a filing issue. "Your mother," he said evenly, "was on morphine. She was terrified of you." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Terrified men say women are hysterical. Terrified boys say mothers were afraid. "I'm 34. "Yes," he said, and still remarkably easy to agitate. There it was. Not roaring, not confession. The needle. Always the needle. Victor stood, walked around the desk, and came closer. The movement was deliberate. He wanted height, presence, air displacement. He had used the same tactic on opposing counsel for decades. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "People get ugly around death. Priests feel important. Old women misremember. Documents from 30 years ago reappear. If you start throwing around accusations of fraud and murder because you found a sentimental package in a bus station locker, you will destroy your mother's memory and humiliate yourself in the process." He was close enough now that I could smell bourbon and mint. "You do not have the temperament for this kind of war, Daniel." That was the moment. Not at the church, not at the locker, not even listening to my mother apologize through static. The moment I realized he had never actually seen me. He knew how to control a grieving widow, a dependent child, a room full of donors, a judge with a golf habit. He knew how to bury paperwork under process and fear under manners, but he had no idea what kind of man gets built in a basement full of records. No idea what 12 years of tracing lies through signatures does to your patience. No idea that I had spent most of my adult life around people whose first instinct was concealment, and that his biggest mistake was assuming family made him harder to read. It did the opposite. Family had given me a lifetime of practice, so I let my shoulders sink, let some hurt show, let him believe the hook was set. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. Victor's face softened by design. "I want you to give me the documents," he said. "I want to have Martin review them. If there's anything legitimate, we handle it privately. Protect your mother's dignity. Protect you. If there's nonsense in there, we dispose of it and move on." Dispose of it. I looked down, counted to 3, then nodded once. "All right." He held out his hand. I gave him the copies. Not the recorder, not the original birth certificate, not the real map notes. Copies. Good ones. Good enough to make him sweat. Good enough to make him move. Good enough to show me where the pressure points were. He took them and relaxed for the first time all evening. That told me everything I needed to know. "Good," he said. "That's wise. Wise." I almost pitied him for how much he enjoyed underestimating me. At the door he said, "One more thing. Do not discuss this with Maya Torres." I turned slowly. His face remained neutral, but it was there again, that thread of iron under the velvet. "Why would you say that?" "Because Maya dislikes me on principle and has the discretion of a match near gasoline. The last thing you need is someone theatrical in your ear." So he had been watching me closer than I realized. Or somebody had. I gave him the most tired smile I could manage. "I just buried my mother, Victor. I'm not plotting a coup." "No," he said. "Of course not." I left, walked down the front steps, got into my truck, drove 3 streets away before exhaling. Then I called Maya from the burner phone she kept in her bakery safe for emergencies and tax season swearing. "He took the bait," I said. "How bad?" "He wants to dispose of my life." She was quiet half a second. "I'm making coffee. Get back here." By midnight, we had a new problem. Victor didn't just know something had surfaced. He knew about Maya specifically, which meant he was either actively watching me or had someone who did. At 1:15 in the morning, Maya's downstairs alarm chimed. We froze. The bakery was closed, the front lights were off. Rain had stopped 2 hours earlier, and the street outside was mostly empty. Maya picked up the rolling pin nearest the stove with a level of confidence I found both admirable and insane. I grabbed the heavy flashlight by the sink and moved to the loft stairs. The motion sensor tripped in the retail space below. One shape passed the frosted glass front door, then another. Not customers, not a random drunk. Slow. Testing. Maya mouthed, "Call police?" I shook my head once and pulled my phone up to record from the shadows above the stairs. The doorknob moved. Not opened. Moved. Then the side alley gate clanged. A minute later, the back delivery door thudded under a shoulder check. Maya went white. Whoever was down there knew the building had 2 entrances. I dialed 911 and kept the phone low. Reported an attempted break-in a voice so calm the dispatcher asked if I was sure it was urgent. While I did, the back door hit again. Harder. Then silence. Then footsteps retreating into the alley. The patrol car arrived 7 minutes later, long enough for whoever it was to disappear. The officers found tool marks on the rear lock and muddy prints near the dumpster, but no suspects. They took a report, suggested cameras, told us it was probably random. Random. At 2 in the morning, the random part of town apparently liked testing locked doors after funerals. When they left, Maya locked the loft, turned to me and said, "Your stepfather is either panicking or cleaning." Both. She looked toward the kitchen table where my documents lay in tidy stacks. "He knows you know." "He knows I know something," I said. "He doesn't know how much." She crossed to the window and peeked through the blinds at the wet street below. Then we moved faster. That was the first night I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I went to Father Adrian. St. Luke's was empty except for a woman lighting candles near the Virgin statue and the janitor vacuuming the vestibule. The priest met me in his office off the side hall, a cramped room with theology books, 2 dying ferns, and a framed photograph of a softball team from 1987. He looked 10 years older than he had the day before. "Did you go home?" he asked. "Yes." His eyes closed briefly. "I told you not to." I needed to see his face. And? He knows something surfaced, not what. Father Adrian rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Then I've done what I feared most." "No," I said. "You did what my mother asked." That seemed to hurt him more. He sat heavily behind his desk and folded his hands. They were priest's hands. Thin, veined, made for pages and blessings, not this. "She came to me 3 months ago," he said. "The first time. She wanted confession without confession. Do you understand?" I did. People raised around church know the difference between admitting sin to God and trying to dump a secret into a priest's lap without formally naming it. One asks for absolution, the other asks for witness. "She was frightened," he went on. "Not of death, of timing. She kept saying, if I tell too soon, he'll take care of it. If I wait too long, Danny won't forgive me." I looked at the ferns because I couldn't look at him. "She gave me that key 2 weeks ago," he said, "and a sealed card with Ruth Calder's address." My head snapped up. "My aunt." He nodded, opened a drawer, and handed me a plain white card. On it was an address in Harbor Point, 3 hours north. Ruth Calder. There it was, a real person, not just a name spoken into a dying recorder. "She is Samuel's sister?" I asked. "Yes, I met her once, years ago. She came here after your mother tried to reach her. Victor arrived before she left. They spoke in the parking lot. She never returned." "What did they say?" Adrian's face tightened. I only heard one sentence clearly. Victor told her, "If you care about the boy at all, you'll stay gone." For a second the room tilted again. How many people had circled my life at a distance because he told them to? How many exits had he stood in front of with that same controlled voice and legal smile? Father Adrian must have read some of that in my face because he leaned forward. "Daniel, don't call me that right now." He nodded, accepting the blow. "Whatever name you choose," he said softly, "do not choose it because he erased the first one. Choose it because it is yours." I put the card in my wallet. Did my mother ever say why she waited so long? He looked down at his desk. "She said shame hardens around a person. At first it feels temporary, then one day you wake up inside it." I left the church angrier at her than before, which felt disloyal and honest at the same time. By noon, Victor had made his next move. 2 men from a security company showed up at the county archives building with a signed authorization to retrieve family legal materials belonging to the Hale estate from my office box. They were polite, professional, wrong. My supervisor, Alma Price, called me downstairs before letting them near anything. Alma was 68, silver-haired, blunt as a shovel, and had once reduced a county commissioner to stammering because he tried to remove records without a chain of custody form. She had no children, no patients, and a voice that could strip paint. When I told her those men were acting on Victor Hale's instruction, her mouth compressed into a line sharp enough to cut wire. "Do you want them arrested?" she asked, "or merely humiliated?" There are women in every town who keep the whole civic skeleton from collapsing. They never get statues. They should. "Humiliated first," I said. Alma nodded. "Good. Arrests make paperwork." She walked upstairs in front of me, took one look at the men waiting by the microfilm desk, and said, "Either produce a court order signed by an actual judge, or remove your loafers from my floor before I educate you." They left in under a minute. One of them called Victor from the parking lot. I watched through the archive window as he turned away, listened, then glanced back at the building with the expression of a man discovering a door he thought would open did not. That afternoon, I filed emergency copies of the trust notes, deed maps, and adoption order into 3 places Victor could not touch quickly: Maya's safe, Alma's private lock drawer at work, and a digital scan set uploaded to a secure server owned by my friend Elliot Shaw. Elliot ran an independent investigative newsletter that specialized in the kind of local corruption big outlets ignore until it becomes impossible. He was lean, bespectacled, permanently caffeinated, and morally allergic to powerful men who used words like family values while moving money through shadow entities. When I showed him the first packet at his office above the print shop, he whistled low. "This isn't a family scandal," he said. "This is a land scandal wearing a family suit." Can you sit on it for 48 hours? Yes, but not because I'm obedient, because if this lands right, it detonates. I left him with 2 copies, no originals, and instructions that if anything happened to me, he published everything. Paranoid? Maybe. But paranoia is just pattern recognition when the wrong people have enough leverage. On Wednesday morning, I drove to Harbor Point to meet Ruth Calder. The town sat under a gray sky near the river, full of old captains' houses and weathered porches, and the kind of money that had gone quieter with age. Ruth lived in a blue house at the end of a street lined with sycamores. I stood on her steps with my hand poised over the bell and felt 10 years old. What do you say to a woman who should have been in your life but wasn't? Hi, I'm the nephew you were told to forget. I rang anyway. She opened the door herself. She was in her 60s, maybe early 70s, with my father's eyes in an older face and a spine so straight it made every sentence look deliberate. She took one look at me and gripped the edge of the doorframe. "Oh," she said. Just that. Not, "Who are you?" Not, "Can I help you?" "Oh." "You know who I am," I said. Her eyes filled instantly, which somehow hit harder than if she'd started sobbing. "You look exactly like him when you're trying not to show what you feel," she said. I hadn't prepared for tenderness. Anger, yes. Resentment, awkwardness. But not that. She let me in without another word. Her living room smelled like cedar and black tea. There were quilts folded over the sofa, back and framed watercolor paintings of the lake on the walls. On the mantel sat a photograph of the man from my mother's picture, Samuel, older than in mine but unmistakable, one arm thrown around Ruth's shoulders. I stood in front of it longer than was polite. "He hated photographs," Ruth said from the doorway, "which is why we don't have enough." I turned. "Did you know where I was all these years?" She didn't lie. I respected her immediately for that. "I knew the town. I knew Victor changed your name. I knew Evelyn stayed." Her mouth tightened on my mother's name. "I tried twice, once after the adoption and once when you were nearly grown. The first time, his lawyer sent a letter implying I was unstable and would be charged with harassment if I contacted you again. The second time I came in person. He met me in the church lot and told me if I cared about you, I would not drag you into old ugliness." Why listen to him? Ruth held my gaze. Because by then I had already lost one brother, and I was terrified of losing his son to a custody fight I could not win. Fair, painful, but fair. We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid out enough of the documents to show I wasn't guessing. She didn't interrupt while I told her what my mother had left, what the priest had said, how Victor had reacted. When I finished, Ruth got up, went to a hall closet, and returned with a long tin box. Inside were letters from Samuel, copies of business notes, a faded legal pad, and one item that made every hair on my arms rise. A marina slip invoice for a dark green Lund fishing boat leased for 6 months by a holding company I recognized from my mother's deed packet, Harbor Crest Holdings, the same shell tied to the Greywater parcels. "This came in Sam's mail by mistake after he died," Ruth said. "I never knew if it mattered, but I kept everything because he was the kind of man who wrote dates in margins and made enemies by refusing to play dirty." She slid the invoice toward me. 3 days before he drowned, he came to my house and told me if anything happened to him, I was to look at Victor first. My throat went tight. "Did you go to the police?" "I did. They were very polite." That bitter little sentence told me exactly how that had gone. She took a breath and asked the question I knew was coming. "Did Evelyn ever love Victor?" I looked down at my mother's apology letter. "I think she hated needing him," I said. "I think after enough years she stopped being able to tell the difference." Ruth nodded once, a woman accepting a truth she had known but never wanted shaped into words. Then she said, "There's one more thing." From the bottom of the tin box, she pulled a sealed envelope addressed to Daniel Rowan Mercer in handwriting I now recognized as my father's. I stopped breathing again. "She gave birth the week before he wrote that," Ruth said. "He told me if he didn't hand it to you himself by your 18th birthday, I was to keep it until I could do it without Victor knowing." I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a single folded page. "Danny, if your aunt is giving you this, then something went wrong and I won't get to be the one who embarrasses you with advice in person. First, I hope you inherited your mother's steadiness and not my habit of trusting men who talk too smoothly in pressed shirts. Second, if you ever hear that I was reckless with money, that is a lie. If you hear I was stubborn, that is true. Third, land is never just land when greedy men suddenly call you friend. I've set things up so that what belongs to you cannot be entirely stolen, only buried. Buried things can be found. If you are reading this as a grown man, then remember something simple. Polite is not the same as good, and quiet is not the same as weak." Love, Dad. I read the last line 4 times. Quiet is not the same as weak. I had no memory of him. None. Not a smell, not a laugh, not the shape of his hand on my head. But there, in one sentence on old paper, was recognition. Like a hand laid across 3 decades. Ruth let me have a minute. Then she asked, "What are you going to do?" I folded the letter carefully. "First," I said, "I'm going to stop letting Victor define the temperature of every room he enters." She smiled then, brief and fierce. That sounds like a Rowan. By the time I drove back to town, the story had widened. It wasn't just murder anymore, or inheritance, or an adoption built on fear. It was pattern. Victor had isolated my mother, threatened my aunt, pressured a priest into silence until death unlocked him, tried to seize documents, possibly sent men to Maya's bakery. He didn't just steal once and survive on the proceeds. He had maintained the theft, fed it, pruned it, made a life inside it. Men like that don't collapse from one clean accusation. You have to take away the walls first. Thursday morning, Victor called me at work and asked if I would have lunch with him, like civilized people. I almost declined. Then I realized the overconfidence in that request was useful. He thought the document grab failing at the archives meant he could still move me socially. Fatherly concern, public setting, nice restaurant, the old game. So I said yes. He chose Bellamy's downtown, where half the legal community went to be seen pretending not to notice each other. White tablecloths, dark wood, waiters who knew which judges tipped and which ones didn't. Victor was already there when I arrived, seated in a corner booth with his jacket off and a file folder beside his water glass. He rose like a man greeting a son after an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Daniel." I slid into the booth but didn't touch the menu. He folded his hands. "I spent all night reviewing those documents." Of course he did. "And?" I asked. "And some of them are authentic but wildly misleading out of context." I nodded like a child in a principal's office. Victor reached for the file folder and pushed a paper across the table. It was a trust disbursement summary showing tuition payments, medical expenses, and a series of account transfers into a custodial fund for my benefit from age 5 through 22. I knew immediately what he was doing. Building gratitude into the record. "I never hid the fact that Samuel left behind a mess," he said. "I cleaned what I could, preserved what was reasonable, paid what had to be paid, raised you as my own. Raised me as his own." The phrase almost impressed me with its nerve. Then he leaned back and lowered his voice. "I also think we both know there are people around you who will use this to attack me because they already resent what I represent." "What do you represent?" His smile barely moved. "Stability, order, success. Men who build things become targets, Daniel. Especially now." That was Victor in one sentence. He could describe embezzlement like public service. The waiter came. We ordered without really seeing the menu. When he left, Victor slid another paper across to me. A draft settlement agreement. My laugh came out before I could stop it. He seemed offended. "I don't see what's amusing." "You wrote me a hush package." "I wrote you a path forward." His tone cooled. "A generous one. A private acknowledgement of Samuel's biological status, a discretionary transfer of certain non-disputed assets, and a recommendation to the Hale Foundation Board for a senior administrative position, enough to honor the past without feeding a circus." There it was. Buy, discredit, contain. Exactly in my mother's order. "What if I don't want a foundation job?" I asked. Victor gave me the small patient smile men like him use on waitresses and nephews and anyone they consider temporarily impractical. "Then take the money and your questions and build a life somewhere else, quietly. Somewhere else, because exile is often dressed as opportunity." I looked at the settlement, then folded it once and tucked it into my jacket. "I'll think about it." Victor relaxed. There it was again. That tiny opening of the shoulders. Confidence. He thought I was drifting back into the pen, so he made his mistake. He lowered his voice another notch and said, "Your mother was not a strong woman, Daniel. She was suggestible. Whatever she recorded for you likely reflects her worst fears, not reality. Don't let a dying woman's guilt become your ruin." I felt the table edge against my palms. He said it so clinically, so mildly, like he was discussing weather damage. My mother had failed me in ways I was still swallowing. But she had lived inside his gravity for decades, and here he was using the tremor in her final voice as leverage after burying her. That was the moment I stopped thinking about this as an inheritance fight. This became demolition. I smiled back at him. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For finally sounding like yourself." He frowned slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." I stood. "You will." Then I walked out and left him with the bill. At 2 that afternoon, Elliot's first piece went live. Not the whole thing. Not yet. Just a measured, sourced article about newly surfaced documents raising serious questions about historic land transfers tied to the early development of the Greywater North Shore, including possible conflicts of interest involving prominent attorney Victor Hale. No murder allegation, no funeral drama, just records, shell companies, dates, maps, enough to get local talk radio foaming by evening and every real estate parasite in town checking old deeds. Victor called me 12 minutes after publication. This time he did not sound fatherly. "What did you do?" I was in the archives basement, reshelving a probate volume from 1978 while Alma hummed Motown at the microfilm machine.
I read old paper. I said, "Stop being clever. Stop being criminal." The silence on the line went so still it almost hissed. Then he said, very softly, "You have no idea what kind of people you are stirring up." That interested me, because men like Victor rarely admit other predators exist unless they need you afraid of them. "Good," I said. "Maybe they can all introduce themselves together." I hung up. Alma looked over her glasses. That sounded medicinal. It was. By Friday morning, the county clerk's office had received 2 public records requests from state investigators. Bellamy's regulars were talking in lowered voices. One councilman canceled a charity photo op with Victor. The first brick had loosened. Then came the call at 5:12 a.m. Maya. I answered on the second ring. "All the front windows are gone," she said. For one stupid second, half asleep, I thought she meant replaced. Then I heard the tremor in her breathing. I was at the bakery in 7 minutes. Glass covered the sidewalk in glittering piles. One patio chair sat upside down in the display case between ruined croissants. Someone had spray-painted Liar across the brick in black paint high enough to require real effort. Maya stood on the curb in a coat over her pajamas, arms folded so tightly she looked breakable. Police were already there. The same Random Theory patrolman. This time his expression said even he knew Random had taken on a suspiciously specific handwriting. He asked if Maya had enemies. She looked at the paint, then at me, then back at him. "Not before Tuesday," she said. I wanted to rage, to shout Victor's name into the wet dawn and let the whole block hear it. Instead I took photos. Close-ups, tool marks, paint patterns, the broken chair, the angle of the thrown brick. A tire track near the alley mouth. Inventory. Maya caught me doing it and gave one slow nod. By 8, Elliot had those photos too. He didn't publish immediately. He just kept building the file. That afternoon, another piece dropped. This one linked the Greywater land controversy to old campaign donations, zoning variances, and a retired detective who had closed Samuel Rowan's drowning as accidental despite contradictory marina records. Again, restrained. Precise. Impossible to dismiss as gossip. Victor's law firm released a statement calling the reporting irresponsible insinuation. It lasted 3 hours before one of the younger partners quietly removed Victor's bio from the firm homepage. Cracks. Good ones. On Saturday, state investigators visited the county archives in person. They asked for ledgers, transfer books, title packets, and microfilm backups from the years surrounding Samuel's death. Alma gave them exactly what procedure allowed and nothing else. When one of them tried to charm extra access out of her by mentioning Victor's name as if it still meant something, she said, "Around here, Mr. Hale is currently a filing subject, not a credential," and sent him back to his forms. I loved her a little for that. That evening, Ruth drove down unexpectedly. She arrived at Maya's loft with a grocery store bouquet and a pie she claimed was store-bought because she didn't trust me enough yet for homemade. Maya adored her instantly. We spent 3 hours at the kitchen table fitting pieces together. Ruth confirmed Harbor Crest Holdings had appeared around Samuel only months before his death. Maya cross-checked shell company officers through archived annual reports. I mapped parcel histories across old tax atlases and current zoning overlays. Elliot called twice with updates from his sources. One former legal secretary remembered shredding trust correspondence after midnight under Victor's instruction for discretion. A retired banker remembered an emergency signature update on a custodial account for a minor child filed the week after Samuel died. The room filled with paper and coffee and the strange intimacy of people constructing truth from fragments. At one point, Ruth picked up the photo of my mother on the dock and touched the edge of it with one finger. She was funny before fear got hold of her, she said. I looked at that young woman laughing into Lake Wind and realized I had spent most of my life with a version of my mother already edited by survival. That was another theft Victor had managed. He didn't just take my father. He took the shape of my mother before I knew her. Sunday brought the first public humiliation. Victor arrived at St. Luke's for service, and someone, nobody ever admitted who, had taped photocopies of the Greywater parcel map to the glass doors under the words "Who owns the dead?" By the time the sexton tore them down, half the congregation had seen them. A woman from the choir texted Maya details in real time. Victor still went inside, because pride is often just fear refusing to sit in the car. But church had changed. That mattered. Places that once reflected him back as honorable were beginning to distort. Monday morning, I filed a petition under my birth name, Daniel Rowan Mercer. Just seeing it on the form steadied something in me. Not because names are magic, because papers are reality in a country built on records. Victor understood that better than anyone. That's why he had changed minds so young. A child can be taught a lie much more easily if it's printed enough times. When the clerk stamped the petition, I felt a small hard click inside my chest. One hinge coming loose. Victor did not take that well. He showed up at the archives building at 4:40 in the afternoon in a navy suit and no smile, which was how I knew he was slipping. Victor never made scenes where clerks might remember them. He asked Alma to borrow me for a private family discussion. Alma, without looking up from her keyboard, said, "Family discussions occur in public buildings all the time, counselor. That's what lobbies are for." So we stood in the lobby under the mural of the county founders while two interns pretended not to eavesdrop. Victor held my name change filing in one hand. Was this meant to hurt me? He asked. I almost admired the narcissism of it. No, then what? It was meant to correct a record. His jaw flexed. You think changing your name makes you Samuel's son? No, I said. It acknowledges I already was. He stepped closer. Be careful. Legitimacy is a dangerous thing to chase when you don't understand what keeps families standing. There it was again. Family as a weapon. Family as a wall. Family as the word men use when they mean obedience. I glanced toward the interns, who were now very carefully stapling nothing. Did you send people to Maya's bakery? I asked. His face did something small and ugly. Then he smiled. Do not accuse me of the behavior of every idiot in town who reads the paper. That answer told me yes more clearly than a confession would have. I held his gaze. You made one mistake, I said. You taught me how men like you think. Victor's smile thinned. No, he said. I taught you how to survive. Don't confuse the two. Then he left. That night, Elliot called and said, I think I found the hinge. He had spoken to a former maintenance worker from the Greywater Marina, now in assisted living, who remembered the day Samuel died because a dark green boat came back with fresh gouges along the starboard side, and its renter looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. The renter had not been Samuel. The worker still had old notebooks because, in his words, management forgot old men write things down too. In the notebook beside the slip number for the green boat was a name, Martin Voss. Not Victor. Martin. I knew that name. Martin Voss was Victor's college roommate and, later, his quiet little fixer in real estate deals nobody wanted traced too closely. He now lived in Arizona and pretended to be retired. The shape of the thing shifted again. Victor hadn't necessarily been alone on the lake. Maybe he hadn't done the pushing himself. Maybe he had. But the circle widened, which meant fear might widen too. And fear makes conspirators clumsy. On Tuesday, state police interviewed Martin Voss in Arizona. By Tuesday night, Martin was on a flight back east. By Wednesday morning, Victor's firm announced he was taking a temporary leave to focus on personal matters. By Wednesday afternoon, 2 board members resigned from the Hale Foundation. By Thursday, the district attorney's office confirmed an active review into potential historical fraud, obstruction, and related offenses connected to the Greywater development. That should have felt like victory. It didn't. Not yet. Because men like Victor do not go quietly from respectable to cornered. They try one last thing. Mine came in the form of my mother's will. Victor had expected it to pass uncontested. Simple marital transfers, personal property, a discretionary memorial fund, and a bequest to me so modest it would have been insulting if it weren't so obviously strategic. But under the will's routine language, Sophia Keene, Maya's cousin and the sharpest probate litigator in 3 counties, found an amendment executed 6 months earlier witnessed by Father Adrian and my mother's hospice nurse. A codicil. Victor had not filed it. He had omitted it entirely from the initial estate packet. I still remember the exact silence in Sophia's office when she finished reading it aloud. The codicil revoked Victor's authority as executor, named me instead, and attached a sealed declaration to be opened in the event of any challenge. Sophia looked up from the page, eyes bright with the kind of professional delight only lawyers and surgeons are allowed. "He sat on this," she said. I stared. "Can he do that?" She laughed once without humor. "He can do lots of things. The question is how many of them are felonies." The sealed declaration contained my mother's final written statement. Not poetic, not vague, brutally plain. She stated that she had reason to believe Victor Hale had concealed assets belonging to Samuel Rowan's estate, pressured her into consenting to my adoption under false pretenses, and intentionally interfered with her attempts to contact Samuel's surviving family. She further stated that if the codicil had not been filed promptly after her death, any delay should itself be investigated as evidence of continuing concealment. My mother, who had spent 20 years hardening inside shame, had apparently saved one clean blade for the end. I sat there with the statement in my hands and felt something crack open that wasn't just anger. She had failed me. She had. But somewhere in the shrinking space before death, she had finally chosen a side. Too late to spare me the years. Not too late to matter. Sophia filed the codicil challenge that afternoon. Victor was served on the courthouse steps at 5:03 while cameras from 2 local stations happened to be nearby, covering an unrelated story. Funny how timing works when enough people start paying attention. He did not explode. Victor was too controlled for that in public. But he did turn, see the camera, and lose the smile before remembering to put another on. That clip ran for 3 days. People love watching masks miss by half a second. Then came Martin Voss. He did not testify out of conscience. Let's be clear. Men like Martin do not wake up moral in their 60s. He testified because Arizona detectives found undeclared offshore account activity, an old boating insurance claim, and enough email remnants between him and Victor to make prison feel suddenly real. He came in through a side entrance, gray, sweating, angry at being made mortal, and sat in a conference room across from state investigators for 6 hours. By evening, Elliot had a source confirming the outline. Martin admitted to meeting Samuel Rowan on Greywater Lake the day he died under Victor's instruction. He claimed the plan had only been to pressure Samuel into signing revised transfer documents. He said Samuel refused. Voices escalated. Boats drifted close. There was a struggle. Samuel went overboard after being struck by the boom arm during the altercation. Accident, maybe in the technical sense. Murder? Maybe in the moral and prosecutorial one. Obstruction and conspiracy? Certainly. Then Martin said the part that made every earlier detail click. Victor had ordered the immediate retrieval of Samuel's leather document satchel from his truck after the funeral. That satchel had contained original trust instructions, account numbers, and the unsigned transfer papers Samuel refused to execute. My mother had not stumbled into proof years later. She had watched proof vanish the week of the funeral. That was why Victor became necessary so fast. He didn't just offer help after tragedy. He inserted himself between a widow and the only documents that could have protected her child. There it was. The architecture. Not one crime. A system. Once you saw the system, the whole marriage looked different. The rescue. The adoption. The isolation. The locked study. The generosity. The way he kept me close enough to influence, but far enough from law. The way he mocked my work with records without ever fully discouraging it, because contempt sometimes blinds people to risk. The way he always wanted me mildly indebted, never independent enough to become curious. I had not been a son in his house. I had been a liability under management. When the first criminal complaint was filed, the town split exactly as towns do. Some said everyone had always known Victor was cold. Some said this was a witch hunt against a successful man. Some said my mother must have been unstable. Some said I should have handled it privately for dignity. That last one made me laugh every time. Dignity, the favorite perfume of people who benefit from silence. The arrest happened on a Friday at 4:18 p.m. in Victor's office parking garage. He had tried to leave through the lower level to avoid cameras. Someone tipped the stations anyway. 2 unmarked cars blocked the exit. Detectives approached from both sides, and Victor Hale, deacon, donor, widower, architect of other people's fates, had to place his manicured hands on the hood of his own Mercedes while a younger man read him his rights. The footage was ugly in the best possible way, not because I enjoy handcuffs, because he looked bewildered. That was the gift. He didn't look noble, or wrongly accused, or tragic. He looked insulted, like the world had breached protocol by touching him. Maya and I watched the clip in the bakery after closing. The front windows had been replaced. The Liar paint scrubbed away, though a faint shadow remained in the brick grooves if you knew where to look. She handed me a cup of coffee and said, "How do you feel?" I looked at Victor on the screen again. Gray-haired, furious, suddenly ordinary. "Lighter," I said. That wasn't the whole truth. I also felt hollow in places, tired beyond sleep. Grief struck in weird delayed waves. My mother was still dead. My father was still a photograph and a sentence and a bloodline. Justice, when it comes late, does not return childhoods. It doesn't restore what should have been normal. It just stops the bleeding from continuing. But Lighter was true enough for that moment. The civil side took longer, of course. Those things always do. Sophia pursued the estate fraud. State investigators pulled title chains. Tax authorities sniffed around old transfers. The Hale Foundation froze certain disbursements. Two of Victor's former clients came forward with unrelated allegations about escrow irregularities. The firm renamed itself within a month and quietly removed his portrait from the lobby. The name change hearing was set for the second week of November. It was a simple matter on paper. One petition, supporting documents. No opposition formally filed because Victor's counsel had larger fires to stomp. But I dressed for it more carefully than for any funeral or wedding I had ever attended. Not because I thought clothes changed truth. Because sometimes you put on the right jacket to honor the fact that you are walking into a room as yourself for the first time. Ruth came down for it. Maya came too. So did Alma, who claimed she had a dentist appointment and arrived carrying a tote bag full of peppermints and contempt. The courtroom was small. The judge was brisk. She reviewed the petition, the birth certificate, the adoption order, the supplemental affidavit, and my stated reasons. Then she looked over her glasses and said, "Mr. Mercer, is this request made freely and without coercion?" I almost smiled. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand the legal implications of resuming use of your birth name?" "Yes." She signed. That was it. Pen to paper. Less than 3 minutes. 3 decades corrected in less time than it takes to boil water. When we stepped into the hallway, Ruth hugged me first. Hard. Maya second, harder. Alma patted my arm once like she was verifying I still had bones. Then I stood by the courthouse window looking out at the square where leaves were turning and people were hurrying with coffees and errands and no idea that my whole internal map had just been redrawn. Daniel Rowan Mercer. Mine. Not because a judge said so. Because a judge could no longer be used to deny it. The criminal case did not finish quickly. Men with Victor's resources make sure of that. Motions. Delays. Health complaints. Character letters from people who had never seen a locked study after midnight. The usual theater. But the evidence held. Martin Voss flipped fully once the state threatened conspiracy enhancements. The retired detective admitted Victor met him privately before the accidental ruling and promised campaign support for the sheriff if the case stayed clean. The omitted codicil became part of a separate probate misconduct referral. Financial auditors traced enough of the Greywater profits forward to establish motive beyond nostalgia or bad memory. Victor eventually accepted a plea on fraud, obstruction, and related financial charges, while the prosecution reserved language acknowledging the unresolved homicide theory surrounding Samuel's death. It was not the perfect ending people crave in comment sections. There was no dramatic murder conviction with thunder outside and everybody gasping. Real life rarely offers perfect categories after 30 years of rot. What it offered instead was this. Victor Hale died socially before he died physically or legally. He lost the firm, lost the foundation, lost the church seat, lost the dinner invitations and the warm handshakes and the professional deference. The city he used to move through like a favored son began stepping around him like a spill. And because he built his whole self on reflected status, that was a punishment he actually felt. The estate fight ended the following spring. The court voided critical transfers tied to the original concealment, restored my standing as Samuel Rowan's heir through the Mercer line, and opened the door to claims against remaining Greywater proceeds. After fees and taxes and all the practical adult words that drain romance from money, the amount left was still enough to alter a life. But the first thing I bought was not a car or a better apartment. It was my father's old marina slip. Not because it made financial sense, because some places should not stay owned by cowards. I also bought Maya's bakery building outright through a quiet LLC and then waited 3 weeks before telling her. When she found out, she cried first, then cursed me for being sneaky, then made me sign papers transferring her the deed at cost plus exactly 1 cinnamon roll. Alma retired in June and let us throw her a party in the archives basement among deed books and probate ledgers because, in her words, any room with more than 12 living people is vulgar. Ruth started visiting once a month. We are learning each other late, which is awkward and lovely and sometimes sad. Family formed after damage has a different rhythm. Less assumption, more choosing. As for my mother, that part took the longest. For months I could not decide what to do with her things. Her scarf still smelled faintly like her. Her recipe box had notes in the margins. Too much time. Danny hates peas. Use the blue dish. Little domestic fingerprints of a woman who had failed me and loved me and feared him and finally, in the only way she had left, tried to push the wall over before she died. People like easy verdicts. Monster. Victim. Coward. Accomplice. My mother was harder than that. She was a frightened woman who mistook survival for surrender until the two fused. She was someone who let a terrible man rewrite a child's life because she could not imagine winning against him. She was also the woman who hid copies, found a priest, recorded the truth through pain, and timed her final acts so Victor would not get to the locker first. Some days I forgive her. Some days I don't. Most days I understand that love can exist alongside damage without excusing it. That is not a clean ending. It is, however, an honest one. A year after the funeral, I went back to Greywater Lake alone. Spring again. Same kind of light as in the old photograph. Wind lifting small silver scales off the surface. I stood at the marina slip and held the St. Christopher medal my mother left in the bank bag. I had it cleaned and put on a new chain. I don't know if it was mine originally or my father's. Maybe that doesn't matter. I took Samuel's letter from my pocket and read the last line one more time. Polite is not the same as good, and quiet is not the same as weak. Then I folded it and looked out over the water where so much of my life had been bent around one man's greed. Victor thought changing my name changed my blood. He thought burying documents buried the truth. He thought a child raised carefully enough would never learn the difference between protection and possession. He was wrong, because paper remembers, water remembers, people remember, even when fear teaches them to stay silent for a while. And when the silence finally breaks, it doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like a key pressed into your hand at a funeral. Sometimes it sounds like your dead mother telling you to be smarter than the man who trapped her. Sometimes it sounds like your own name coming back to you after 34 years, fitting so perfectly you realize it was never truly gone. I was not the son Victor Hale made. I was the son he failed to erase. And in the end, that made all the difference.